The world outside his cabin had gone quiet long before winter came. But on most mornings, George Whitaker still rose before the sun, because that's what a man does when he's spent his life listening for wild things. He didn't know what day it was anymore, but he knew how the sky looked just before it broke open. There's a kind of silence you only find out here in the Gila wilderness of New Mexico. It's not the kind that presses down. It's the kind that breathes with you. A place where wind sifts through the juniper. And if you're patient enough, you can hear the pulse of the desert itself. George lived in that silence. A small solar cabin, a coffee pot that took its time, and a single porch chair that creaked every time he leaned back to watch the horizon turn gold. Some mornings he remembered why he was there. Others, he didn't. People who study memory loss say it's like fog rolling across a familiar landscape. You still know the land is there, you just can't see it anymore. For George, it started with misplaced keys, then the wrong date on his medication bottle, and later, forgetting the reason he'd moved here in the first place. His doctor had called it early-stage Alzheimer's. His neighbor, a retired nurse named Grace, called it a slow unthreading. But George didn't call it anything. He just tried to stay busy. He stacked wood. He fed the chickadees that gathered on the porch railing. He left fresh water out for the deer, though he knew they rarely came close. Keep the routine, the therapist had said. The mind finds comfort in repetition. So he did. At 6 each morning, George brewed coffee strong enough to wake a ghost. He set 2 mugs on the table. One black, one with a faded blue rim chipped at the handle. The blue one had belonged to Amelia, his wife of 43 years. It had been 2 years since she passed, and yet he still set it out every day. Out of habit, out of hope, out of love that refused to admit she was gone. Sometimes he talked to her while the radio played quietly in the background, those old folk stations with static between songs. "You'd laugh at me now," he'd say, pouring her cup full though no one drank it. "Still burning the toast." He smiled, not because it was funny, but because that's what keeps a man human when the walls start echoing back only his own voice. After breakfast, George would walk the perimeter of his land, same as he had for years as a park ranger. Not to check for trespassers, there hadn't been one in decades, but to remember that he was still part of something living. He'd touch the bark of the old cottonwood by the creek and murmur, "Still standing, huh?" He'd stop at the rock pile where the quails nested and listen for the soft drumming of their wings, each gesture a kind of prayer. Amelia used to tell him that kindness wasn't a grand act, it was the accumulation of small, steady ones. That was before her heart gave out one autumn evening in the middle of folding laundry. After that, George stopped folding clothes. He just let them dry on the line and took them down when he needed them. Out here, no one noticed. To someone passing through his life might have looked lonely. But there's a difference between being alone and being left alone. George had chosen this solitude. He'd bought the land after retiring from the National Park Service, where he'd spent 35 years tracking elk populations and rescuing lost hikers. The work had kept him close to nature and far from everything else, including his son Lucas. That's what happens when a man mistakes silence for peace. On the mantel above the cold fireplace sat a single photograph. It showed George, Amelia, and a teenage boy squinting against the mountain sun. Lucas, age 16, holding up a camera, proud of a photograph he'd taken of a wild bobcat. That bobcat had been the first time George saw his son look alive since Amelia's surgery. He remembered the flash of the animal's eyes, the fluid grace of its step. "They're not mean, Dad," Lucas had said. Just misunderstood. It was the last real conversation they'd had before everything fell apart, before the enlistment papers, before the silence that stretched for years. George didn't know if Lucas was alive. The last letter came back marked, "Return to sender." He kept it anyway. There's something cruel about the way memory slips. It doesn't take the things you want to forget. It takes the things you need. George couldn't remember the last words his wife. The first rule of the wild is simple. Anything wounded runs. But that morning, as rain crept over the New Mexico hills, the dying bobcat stayed. George knelt in the wet dirt, his breath showing in the chill. Koda lay motionless, except for the rise and fall of his ribs, thin, uneven, fragile. The rain gathered along the animal's whiskers, tracing the dust off its face. George whispered without meaning to. "You shouldn't be here, fella. You should have run." For years, he'd watched wild creatures vanish at the first scent of a man. Bobcats were ghosts of the desert, seen only in tracks or a flash of gold eyes at dusk. And yet this one had crossed the threshold of a human's porch as if it had known where to go. In wildlife biology, there's a word for this kind of behavior displacement. It happens when animals are too exhausted to act on instinct, when pain outweighs fear. But what George saw didn't feel like that. There was a strange calm in Koda's eyes, a focus that didn't belong to something fading. The rational part of his mind whispered infection, dehydration, shock. The other part, the one that used to believe in the mystery of the land, felt something else. Like the bobcat had carried a message through the wilderness just to deliver it here. He went inside and came back with an old wool blanket, the one Amelia used to wrap around her shoulders when the power cut out. He hesitated, remembering how she'd scolded him once for interfering with wild things. "Let nature take care of itself," she'd said. But nature had brought this one to his door. He knelt and laid the blanket gently over Koda's body. The animal flinched, then went still again. When George touched the collar, he felt the smooth leather cord and the cold weight of a tag. A small silver disc hand-stamped Koda on one side and on the back barely visible under rust, FWP Rehab 11. Wildlife Rehabilitation. He recognized the abbreviation. Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. Which meant someone had once tried to save this animal before. He exhaled. "So you've known people before, haven't you?" Koda's ear twitched at the sound of his voice. There's something ancient in the way humans and animals meet through pain. It's not about ownership, it's about recognition. One soul recognizing another, both battered in their own way. George could see the tremor in the bobcat's flank, the way his paws pressed into the earth as if trying to remember what solid ground felt like. He knew that feeling, that quiet panic of forgetting where you belong. He whispered, "We're both a little lost, huh?" The bobcat's breathing steadied barely, but enough. It's strange how a dying creature can make a man feel more alive. Bobcats, unlike their bigger cousins, live solitary lives. They survive by instinct, not by packs or herds. They adapt quietly. They hunt rabbits and mice, keep the balance in the ecosystem. Most people never see one. Those who do rarely forget. In old Native American stories, the bobcat represents vigilance and patience, the watcher of the boundary between worlds. And here was one lying across George's porch, right on that invisible border between wilderness and home. It wasn't just an animal anymore. It was a question. George brought out a shallow bowl of water, set it beside Koda's head. The animal didn't move for a long while. Then, with a slow, shaking effort, Koda lifted his head and drank. The sound was small, but it filled the whole porch, the rhythm of life fighting back. George sat cross-legged nearby, knees aching, watching. He remembered a time years ago when a ranger under his watch had rescued a fawn tangled in barbed wire. The young ranger asked if they'd done the right thing. George had said, "Sometimes you don't get to know. You just help and hope the wild forgives you." He found himself repeating those words under his breath now. You just help and hope. That night, the rain turned heavy. George set up a corner in the mudroom, laid down an old tarp and a folded quilt. Koda lay there, silent eyes half open, breath steady but shallow. Unable to sleep, George rummaged through a drawer he hadn't touched in years. Inside was a small box of keepsakes, ranger pins, Amelia's rosary, and an envelope addressed in faded ink, Lucas Whitaker, returned to sender. He sat by the oil lamp, staring at his son's name. He remembered Lucas talking once about working with wildlife rehab programs. "Dad, we can't just tag and track them. We have to help them heal." George had argued back then, called it interference. Now, looking at the wounded bobcat under his roof, he wasn't so sure he'd been right. He whispered into the still air, "Maybe you were onto something, boy. There's a strange symmetry to how life circles back when you're not looking." The wild thing he once studied from a distance now breathed under his care. The son he once argued with had vanished into that same wilderness. Maybe the world doesn't give us second chances, it just gives us echoes. And sometimes, if we listen closely, those echoes find their way home. By morning, the storm had cleared. A beam of light spilled through the window onto the quilt. Koda stirred, his paw shifting across the fabric. The movement revealed something George hadn't noticed before a small scrap of paper caught under the collar strap. It was damp, fragile, almost unreadable. He lifted it carefully with tweezers and laid it flat on the table. On one side, a hand-drawn map. On the other, 3 words scrawled in pencil. "Follow the canyon." George stared at it for a long time. He knew the canyon well. It was where the old ranger station had stood before. It burned down a place filled with half-buried memories. "Who brought you from there?" he murmured. The bobcat blinked once, slow and steady. "Nature doesn't draw straight lines. It weaves circles. Every loss becomes soil for something new. Every creature a thread in the same design." Maybe George thought that's why the wild never truly feels empty. Even in silence, something's always listening. Koda was proof of that. A wild heart that had crossed miles to die at the feet of the man who once mapped its kind. Or maybe to lead him back towards something he'd lost. That afternoon, George called Grace Monroe, the retired veterinarian who lived down in the valley. She arrived by dusk, her old pickup rattling up the gravel road. She stepped into the cabin, quiet but sure. "What have you got for me this time, Whitaker?" she teased softly. When she saw Koda, her voice changed. "That's no stray." Grace examined the wounds, her touch calm and deliberate. "Gunshot graze," she murmured. "Older, though. And these scars, he's been patched up before. Someone took care of him once." She found the rehab mark tattooed faintly inside the ear. "Fish and wildlife, all right. Unit 11, that's north of here. But this collar..." She traced the emblem, a small sun etched beside the letters, FWP. "That's custom. Someone wanted him found." George felt the weight of her words. Wanted him found. Grace looked up, her eyes soft. "You gonna keep him alive, George?" He hesitated. "I'll try. That's all any of us can do." After Grace left the cabin, filled with the hum of the oil lamp and the rhythmic breathing of 2 old souls. One man, one beast keeping each other company against the dark. George found himself talking without meaning to. Funny, isn't it? All my life I told people not to get too close to wild things. Now here I am sharing a blanket with one. He thought of Amelia, how she used to whisper to the hummingbirds as if they were her neighbors, how she said kindness was the only language the wild still understood. Maybe that's what healing was, not fixing what's broken, but staying with it long enough for trust to return. He reached out and brushed the fur gently, the way you'd smooth the wrinkles of a forgotten photograph. Koda didn't flinch this time. You learn things when you grow older, things too simple for youth to notice. Like how love and fear come from the same heartbeat, or how animals, without saying a word, teach us everything about grace. Koda's presence began to steady George's days. Feeding him became a ritual. Listening to his breathing replaced the radio static. He stopped forgetting his medicine. He stopped waking up unsure of where he was. The bobcat had given him purpose again, not through gratitude, but through need. Sometimes that's all it takes to keep a man tethered to the world. A week later, when the rain came again, George pinned the fragile map to the wall above his workbench. The red ink trail marked a winding path through the wilderness he once patrolled, ending at a point labeled Station 9. He traced it with his finger, something stirring beneath the fog of his memory. "Follow the canyon," he whispered. Koda lifted his head from the blanket and watched him. Outside, thunder rumbled again, distant but calling. George felt it deep in his bones, the sense that the story wasn't finished yet, that this wounded creature had arrived not just to be saved, but to lead him somewhere. Sometimes the wild sends us messengers in forms we don't expect. A wounded animal, a memory, a second chance. If you've ever felt like something found you at the exact moment you needed it, stay close. Because in the next part, you'll see what happens when George follows the canyon and discovers what Koda was trying to show him all along. Sometimes when a person disappears, they don't vanish all at once. They just start showing up in fewer places until one day you realize you haven't seen them in years. And yet even in absence, they leave signs. George stood in the kitchen, fingers resting on the edge of the drawer. It had been years since he opened it. Inside lay ordinary things, pens without ink, an old trail compass, receipts curled from time, and a photo. Lucas, smiling in a way George hadn't seen in decades. That kind of smile boys have before life teaches them to guard it. His son stood next to a ranger truck, a bandana around his neck, a clipboard in hand. One boot rested on a crate marked Wildlife Transport, FWE Unit 11. George turned it over. Amelia's handwriting was faint but clear. Lucas, age 25, just before Montana. He'd meant to call that day, but didn't. George hadn't lost his son in a dramatic way. There was no blow-up, no slammed doors. It was smaller than that. 1,000 little silences that piled into distance. A disagreement about the future, a missed call, a visit postponed. Lucas had joined a wildlife rehabilitation program for veterans, a rare one that worked with both people and animals. George didn't understand it back then. Sounds more like therapy than science, he'd muttered once. Lucas just smiled. Maybe we need both. That was the last time they'd spoken without something between them. 2 years later, a package came in the mail. No return address, just to Dad. Inside was a book on bobcat tracking and a folded map. One line written in Lucas's neat print, still following the wild. George had written back, but the letter returned unopened. He kept it anyway. Not because of what it said, but because it had his handwriting on the envelope, a kind of proof that he'd tried. Grief doesn't always come in death. Sometimes it arrives as a space at the dinner table year after year. Looking at that photograph now, George wondered if the map from Koda's collar was Lucas's doing. It wasn't just a hunch. It was a feeling that lived low in his ribs like memory trying to break through. He remembered Lucas as a boy tracing animal tracks in the snow with his finger. Every footprint's a sentence, he used to say. Even then he spoke like someone born to listen. And now, this bobcat, scarred, silent, but deliberate, had crossed wilderness to collapse at his feet. It felt less like coincidence and more like a message. Maybe Lucas hadn't vanished. Maybe he'd just left breadcrumbs in fur and dust. Across the United States, there are programs often hidden from headlines that connect veterans with wild animals, not as handlers, not as owners, but as companions in healing. From Mustang rescues in Nevada to raptor rehab in Arizona, these places understand something medicine sometimes forgets. That trauma doesn't always need to be explained. Sometimes it just needs a place to breathe. Lucas had joined one of those programs, one that worked with semi-rehabilitated predators, animals too wild to return, too broken to cage. They lived in that middle space, just like the veterans who cared for them. Grace returned the next day to check on Koda. She brought fresh bandages and a packet of old files from her time consulting with wildlife rehab centers. George showed her the photo and the map. Her brow furrowed. Unit 11? That's the same program Lucas worked with, right? George nodded. Last I heard. Grace laid the files on the table. I think I have something. She pulled out a typed report from 2014. A field note from the rehab unit director. At the bottom, transfer completed. Handler L. Whitaker. Animal BC-K11. Hybrid release pending. BC, Bobcat, Koda. George stared at the paper. He trained him. Grace touched his hand. Looks like he trusted Koda to find you. The strange thing about legacy is that it doesn't always come from children following your footsteps. Sometimes it comes when they take another path entirely and send something back to show they're okay. George had spent his life managing boundaries between man and animal, between land and policy. Lucas had stepped into the spaces he feared most. The ones with no clear lines, no fences, just trust. It hurt in its own way to realize your son had become the kind of man you didn't know how to be. But it also brought something George hadn't felt in a while. Pride. That evening, George sat beside Koda. The map unfolded between them. The red ink trail curved along familiar canyons, ending at a point marked with a single "sa." He whispered, "If this is what you want me to see, I'll go." Koda shifted as if acknowledging the promise. George didn't know if Lucas would be there, didn't know if he was alive. But the map was clear, and something in him older than memory, deeper than grief, told him it was time to follow. He packed slowly. 2 canteens, the ranger compass, a small pouch with Amelia's rosary just in case, and the letter creased and worn addressed to Lucas. Still sealed. This time he'd try again. People talk about memory as something we hold, but sometimes it holds us. It pushes us toward the things we're not ready to remember until we are. George stood on the porch before sunrise, the pack at his feet. Koda lay resting inside, eyes closed, but breathing steady. Grace arrived just before he left her truck, crunching the gravel. "I'll watch him," she said. "You go find the rest." George nodded, unable to speak. Sometimes goodbye doesn't need words. Just trust. Have you ever followed a path not because you knew where it led, but because something in you whispered that you needed to? Because in the next part, George follows the canyon trail, and what he finds waiting will change everything he thought he knew about loss, forgiveness, and the wild places love hides. Some places don't just hold memories, they hold ghosts. Not the kind that rattle windows, but the quieter kind. The kind that wait for you to return. George moved slow but steady. The trail hadn't been cleared in years, but his feet remembered what his mind sometimes didn't. He walked through pine shadow and canyon wind, carrying only what mattered: water, a field compass, a worn photo of his son, and a folded map drawn by a bobcat. The land rose around him like a cathedral. High cliffs, dry brush, the scent of creosote rising with the sun. Birds called from somewhere unseen. The air was cooler here. It had been 20 years since he'd last stepped into this canyon, back when Station 9 still stood, back before the fire, before the silence. Station 9 wasn't much. Just a field base, tin-roofed and half-hidden in stone for park service teams studying predator behavior. It was where George had trained new rangers, ran fieldwork on elusive cats, and watched his son discover what it meant to care for something wild. Lucas had loved it there. Not for the research, but for the peace. "It's the only place where nothing asks me to explain myself," he once told George. Then came the blaze, a dry lightning strike, a failed response time, and a storm that took more than timber. After that, the station was shut down. George never went back. As he neared the old site, he saw the remnants, metal posts, warped from heat-stone outlines where walls had once been. The wind shifted, and something moved. He stepped carefully toward a pile of half-collapsed crates. One was marked with faint letters, FWP, medical, rehab supply. Inside, under layers of dust and melted plastic, was a crate of old field journals. He flipped one open. The handwriting was familiar. Lucas. Day 41. Koda recognized the call signal again. Progress slow but steady. He's not like the others. Doesn't flinch at touch anymore. Stays near camp at night. Feels like he's watching over me more than I'm watching him. George sat down hard on a fallen beam. The book trembled in his hands. There are some things you can't prepare for. Like reading your son's words in the middle of nowhere years after you thought you'd lost him for good. Lucas had been alive here, not just surviving, but writing, hoping, building trust with an animal, and maybe in some quiet way with the world again. George traced the page. The ink had bled from moisture, but the heart of it was still clear. Koda wasn't just a rehab subject, he was family. And now, that same animal had brought George back to this very place. Rehabilitation programs for wild predators are rare. Too dangerous, too unpredictable. But a few bold researchers, often veterans themselves, have challenged that thinking. They believe healing doesn't always look like a clean recovery. Sometimes it's messy, sometimes it limps. They've worked with wolves, coyotes, even bobcats, bridging trust between trauma and instinct. Lucas had joined one of these programs as a handler not long after returning from deployment. George had dismissed it as fringe work at the time. But now, with his boots in the dust of that station journal in hand, he understood something deeper. This was Lucas's way of making meaning out of pain. In what was left of the main cabin, George found another clue. On the back of a broken metal cabinet, a sentence had been etched in black charcoal. "If he ever finds this, tell him I'm not lost. Just working. L.W." George leaned against the wall. He could hear Amelia's voice in his head, soft and steady. He needed space to figure out how to stay. It hadn't been abandonment. It had been survival. We talk a lot about visible wounds. But what about the ones that don't bleed? The ones shaped like memory or regret. The ones that sit in the bones of men too proud to cry. George had carried his own buried beneath duty, masked by routine. And Lucas had carried his too. They just didn't know how to offer them to each other. But here in this canyon, stripped by fire and time, their pain had finally met. Not in confrontation, but in recognition. Just before sunset, George found a flat rock near the edge of the bluff. Someone had carved initials into it, barely visible beneath moss. K plus L plus G. He knelt beside it, ran a hand over the stone. 3 letters, 3 lives. The father, the son, the Bobcat. All of them scarred, all of them still standing. Have you ever felt pulled to a place not for what's there now, but for what it meant? And what it still wants to give back? Because in the next part, George will find that some echoes don't just haunt, they guide. And what Koda reveals next will uncover a truth neither man nor animal could carry alone. In every small town, there's someone who stays behind when everyone else leaves. Not because they have nothing to chase, but because they know some places still need tending. George came down from the canyon a changed man. Not younger, not stronger, but steadier, like a tree that had weathered another storm and stayed upright. He carried Lucas's journal in one hand and a silence in the other. Koda limped beside him, weaker now but alert. Each step from the wilderness back toward home felt like walking through 2 different lives. As they neared the edge of town, a familiar truck waited at the gate. Grace Monroe. She stepped out, arms folded, eyes scanning Koda with a practiced calm. "You found what you were looking for?" she asked. George nodded. Some of it. Grace wasn't just a retired vet. She was the kind of woman who remembered everyone's birthdays even when they forgot their own. She ran the small-town clinic out of her converted barn and still answered calls in the middle of the night. Cats stuck in fences, deer hit by cars, dogs that wouldn't stop shaking. More than that, she'd known Lucas since he was a boy. When Amelia died, it was Grace who brought soup every Thursday. Not because George asked, but because some people understand grief needs quiet company more than words. She had stayed in that valley long after most people her age had gone to be near grandkids or warmer winters. "Somebody's got to keep watch," she once said. "Nature doesn't retire." Behind Grace's clinic, there's a wildflower garden. No fences, no markers. Just a soft chaos of color milkweed cone. Flowers, black-eyed Susans. George once asked why she never put up signs. She smiled and said, "Every flower's for something I couldn't save." No need to name what's already remembered. That garden had seen more prayers than most churches. She walked George through it after Koda's second night at her place. "He's stabilizing," she said, kneeling to press her fingers against the cat's belly, feeling for infection. "But he's tired, George. Not just sick, worn." George nodded. "He made it this far. I owe him the rest." Grace looked at him for a long moment, then she nodded back. "You both do. There's a kind of love that doesn't announce itself. It shows up with gauze and broth and a chair pulled close when you need it most." Grace had loved in that way her whole life. Through animals, through people, through every single act of care she never expected thanks for. And George, who had spent so many years resisting help, found himself leaning into her steadiness, like a man relearning how to be held up. He began stopping by daily. Not just to check on Koda, but to ask about the garden, the birds she tracked, the old recipes she tried in her spare time. Each visit unspooled the loneliness just a little. In rural communities across the country, older women like Grace are the quiet backbone. They volunteer at shelters, run clinics out of sheds, plant trees after storms. They are the ones who still write cards by hand, who remember what the land looked like before the mall, before the bypass, before the noise. They carry both memory and medicine, and understanding that healing isn't fast or loud. It's built slowly, with presence. Grace had stitched up strays and saved calves. She had buried old pets beside their people. She had seen life come full circle more times than she could count, and she had chosen again and again to stay. One evening, George brought by a quilt Amelia had made decades ago. He unfolded it carefully. On Grace's exam table, patches of forest green and deep burgundy worn soft at the edges. She used to wrap Lucas in this when he was little, he said. Thought maybe Koda would sleep better with something that remembered him. Grace didn't say anything right away. She just ran her fingers over the stitching, then laid it gently in Koda's crate. That night, the Bobcat slept deeply for the first time since he'd arrived. Some people think we save animals, but more often they save us by connecting the parts of ourselves we've let drift too far apart. Koda had done that. He brought George back to Lucas. He brought George to Grace. He brought breath into a house that had been holding it too long. Even in his fragility, the Bobcat reminded them what it means to trust, to be near something wild, and not try to tame it, only honor its presence. Before George left that evening, he noticed an old brass bell tied to Grace's fence post. It was worn smooth, barely made a sound in the wind. "What's that for?" he asked. She smiled. "Back when I started here, folks would ring it if they needed help, and I wasn't inside. Does anyone still use it?" She shrugged. "Not often, but I keep it there just in case." George paused, then rang it gently. The bell didn't ring loud, but the sound lingered, like something remembered. Have you ever known someone who stayed? Not because it was easy, but because they believed tending the quiet things still mattered. In the next part, George and Grace follow what Koda left behind, and a door opens to something no one expected, something not quite wild, and not quite gone. Some journeys don't begin when we take the first step. They begin the moment we realize there's something left unfinished, and that we might still have time to reach it. The paper map was creased from the damp, faded at the corners, but still clear. Red ink marked a jagged path through hills and ravines, ending at a place labeled Only Hollow Ridge. It was tacked above George's kitchen table, lit now by a flickering lamp. Outside, the moon hung low over the desert, quiet as breath. Grace poured 2 mugs of tea. "He marked this," she said softly, tapping the map. "And you found his journals up by Station 9. If Lucas wanted you to see something, this is it." George nodded. The air between them felt full of things unsaid. Hope, fear, guilt. But beneath it all, one truth held. You don't leave a trail unless you want someone to follow. Hollow Ridge wasn't on most maps anymore. Once it had been a ranger outpost, then a temporary wildlife station. Later, a holding site during a brief experimental phase rehab for semi-domesticated wildcats, monitored under restricted access. The program ended quietly, underfunded and overshadowed by larger operations. But Lucas had worked there briefly, just a few months. Enough time to leave something behind. Grace remembered visiting him once. He said the ridge felt like it was holding its breath, she recalled, like something was waiting. Now, a decade later, it was calling again. They packed slowly. George gathered the same field gear he'd once used as a ranger: binoculars, a weather radio. A flare he doubted still worked. Grace filled a small cooler with medical supplies and 2 flasks of broth. Koda, though still weak, lifted his head when they moved. His eyes followed George like he knew what was happening. "You think he remembers?" George asked. Grace didn't answer at first. She just crouched beside the Bobcat and placed a hand near his paw. "I think some bonds go deeper than memory. Even ours." They left before dawn. The road to Hollow Ridge wasn't really a road anymore, more like the ghost of one half swallowed by brush and time. George drove slowly, tires crunching through gravel and loose stone. Grace sat beside him, watching the sky shift from slate to pale gold. No one spoke for a while. The silence felt earned, not awkward, just peaceful. The kind that settles between people who trust each other with more than words. Behind them, Koda lay nestled in the back, eyes closed but alert. His breathing was slow, steady, present. In some indigenous traditions, certain animals are believed to guide the lost not just across land, but through life. They appear in dreams, in seasons of grief, in moments when we don't know what to do next. Bobcats, in particular, have long been seen as protectors of boundaries, walking the edge between wilderness and home instinct and trust. That image fit now. Koda wasn't leading with his feet anymore. He was guiding with his presence, anchoring George to a purpose bigger than just reunion. He was the bridge between the past and what came next. By midday, the road disappeared completely. They continued on foot. Dry grass brushed their shins. The air smelled of juniper and sun-warmed earth. Then just beyond a bend in the ridge, they saw it. A low structure, half buried in rock and shadow. Weathered metal doors, vines creeping up the sides. George's breath caught. This was the holding site. He stepped forward. The wind picked up, carrying with it the faintest sound, metal on metal. A door shifting, a latch unfastened. Grace turned to him. "You ready?" He nodded. They entered slowly. The air inside was cool and stale, but not empty. Dust floated in shafts of sunlight that broke through cracks in the ceiling. Old medical crates, a stack of weather-warped notebooks, a bedroll in the corner used recently. Someone had been here. George found a thermos still warm, a tin of jerky half open, and on a nearby shelf, a photo. Lucas, smiling, standing next to Koda, much younger, his fur darker, fuller. In the photo, Koda was leaning against Lucas like a dog might. Not wild, not tame, just loyal. Grace found the journal tucked in the corner under a stone. On the first page, dated just weeks ago, one sentence: "If Koda makes it back, I'll know it's safe to come home." George stared at it for a long time. Then he sat down. "He's alive," he whispered. "My boy's alive. Not in theory, not in memory. Here, now." There's a strange thing that happens when hope returns. It doesn't rush in like a storm. It slips in quietly like sunlight on the floor after weeks of rain. George felt that warmth now. Not in his hands, not in his chest, but in the part of him that had stayed quiet for years. The part that never stopped missing his son, even when the rest of him tried to forget. They stepped outside as the wind changed again. And then, from just beyond the ridge, a bark. Not quite a dog, not quite a warning. Grace turned. George froze. Koda lifted his head, and then slowly, he stood. Some sounds don't just break silence. They open doors. If you've ever stood at the edge of a moment, heart ready but unsure what waits on the other side, stay close. Because in the next part, George will discover what or who has been waiting, and what happens when the wild and the wounded find each other again. Sometimes the ones we lose aren't gone. They're just waiting in the quiet, holding their breath until it feels safe to be seen again. The call echoed again, low, sharp, somewhere between a bark and a warning. Not a threat, not a greeting, something in between. George stood still, heart thudding, the kind of stillness a man knows from time spent in forests, in search and rescue fields, in loss. It's the moment you know you're not alone, but you don't know what's coming next. Koda stood beside him now, steadier than he'd been in days. His ears perked, his eyes fixed on the tree line ahead. Then came the shape. A man moving slow, cautious, as though unsure if the world was still real. And behind him, a second bobcat. Smaller, younger, nervous but not wild-eyed. The man stepped forward into the light. Thin, weathered, beard streaked with silver, but the eyes were the same. Lucas. No one moved at first. Even time seemed to pause. It was Grace who broke the stillness. She stepped forward slowly, quietly, giving the moment room. Lucas looked at George, words thick in his throat. "I didn't know if it was safe. If it was time." George nodded, unable to speak. Grace placed a gentle hand on Lucas's arm. "Koda made it home." Lucas knelt beside the older Bobcat. Koda didn't flinch. He pressed his head lightly into Lucas's hand. A weight returned to its place. Lucas looked up. I left the map. I didn't think he'd survive the trip. But if he did... His voice cracked. If he did, I knew you'd come. They sat by a fire that night. Lucas spoke slowly, not like a man reliving the past, but like one setting it down. After leaving the ranger program, he'd worked with a private wildlife rehab initiative, small, deeply underfunded, focused on predator integration. It was there he bonded with Koda. Not as a pet, not as a test subject, but as something else entirely. We weren't trying to tame them, he said. We were just learning how to live near them, how to heal together. He paused, hand resting on Koda's back. When the program lost funding, everything scattered. A few of us stayed to protect the last of the animals. Quietly. Off-grid. Lucas didn't disappear to escape his family. He stayed behind to protect the ones no one else would. It wasn't a tearful reunion. There were no speeches, no big apologies. Just two men, father and son, sharing a fire, a silence, and the Bobcat that had led them back to each other. Sometimes love doesn't return with fanfare. It shows up with a nod, a shared memory, a bowl of soup passed without a word. George sat beside his son and watched the flames flicker on the walls of the old outpost. I thought I'd lost you, he finally said. Lucas nodded. You didn't. Across rural America, there are men and women living quietly at the edge of things, caring for what's left behind. Old barns converted into wildlife shelters. Volunteers trekking miles to monitor migration paths. Retired rangers still walking trails no longer on the map. They don't do it for recognition. They do it because someone has to. Lucas had become one of them. Not out of duty, but love. And he wasn't alone. The younger Bobcat kept his distance that first night. Lucas called him Milo. He wasn't fully wild, but not trusting either. A rescue from a closed-down operation in Arizona. Scarred, skittish. And yet when Koda moved toward him, Milo followed. Tentative, like a younger sibling testing safety. Grace watched the pair and whispered to George, "That's what healing looks like. Not loud, not sudden, just one life showing another. It's okay to stay. We're taught that wild things flee, that broken things hide, that once someone disappears, they're gone. But sometimes the ones who disappear are just waiting for a sign that it's safe to come back." Koda had been that sign. His journey, his loyalty had done what letters and phone calls never could. He had walked the land between two men and closed it. That night, George didn't sleep much. He sat by the fire long after the others had drifted off, watching embers pulse like a quiet heartbeat. In the distance, Milo curled against Koda. Lucas slept in the same role George had once used as a ranger. Grace snored softly on the porch, arms folded like she meant to stay just a minute. Everything felt placed. Not perfect, but whole. George looked at the stars and whispered, "You came back." He wasn't sure if he meant Lucas or himself. Some stories don't end in rescue. They end in return. If you've ever waited for someone to come back or wondered if it was too late to return yourself, stay close. Because in the final part, you'll see how healing ripples out, and how the smallest act of love can change more than just one life. The wild never says goodbye the way we expect. It leaves no notes, no clean endings, but if you pay attention, it always leaves something behind. The snow came early that year. Not the heavy kind, but soft flurries, just enough to settle on the porch railings and outline the shape of a paw print or a boot step. George stood at the window of the cabin, coffee warming his hands. Outside, the light hadn't fully risen yet. The valley below was quiet, touched by frost. Koda was gone. His body had given out a few weeks after they returned from Hollow Ridge. Not suddenly and not painfully. He passed on a morning like this, cold, quiet, with his head resting against George's boot. A peaceful ending, if such a thing exists. They buried him beneath the cottonwood tree near the creek. The one Lucas used to climb when he was 10. The one Amelia had once strung with wind chimes. They didn't use a marker, just a smooth stone and a hand-carved plaque, not tamed, not forgotten, just home. After Koda's death, something shifted. Lucas began writing again field notes, old letters, even drafts of a guide for working with semi-wild rescues. Grace reopened her clinic full-time with new volunteers showing up weekly, and George found himself waking earlier, feeding birds, answering emails from strangers who had seen the story online. One woman from Wyoming sent a photo of her rescued shepherd with the message, "If Koda made it home, maybe mine will too." The video Grace posted of Koda's journey, quiet, unedited, just clips of his healing and his loyalty, had gone further than anyone expected. Not viral, but true. And sometimes that's even better. They started arriving slowly. A postcard from a man in Montana. "I didn't talk to my dad for 14 years. I called him after watching this." An envelope with a child's drawing Koda beside a small girl and her cat. "Thank you for helping the Bobcat. I hope he is with the stars now." One came from a woman in New Mexico, handwritten, careful script. "I used to think I was too old to matter, but Grace reminded me our hands still know how to heal. Thank you for sharing her with us." These weren't just notes of kindness, they were echoes. Proof that the story hadn't ended, it had rippled outward. The hardest part about loving something wild is letting it go. But maybe that's not the whole truth. Because even after Koda's body was gone, George could still feel him. In the quiet moments when the wind moved through the pine. In the way the porch creaked under just the right weight. In Titan Lucas's new rescue dog, nudging his leg at 8 a.m., reminding him it was time for breakfast. The animals still needed tending. The world hadn't stopped needing care just because one creature was gone. And George hadn't stopped needing purpose. None of them had. We often think of legacy as something big, a monument, a book, a breakthrough, but Koda's legacy was smaller, quieter, deeper. It lived in the way Milo, the younger Bobcat, now approached Lucas without fear. In the smile that came to George's face when he heard a new voice ask about adoption at the sanctuary. In the way Grace stood taller when she talked about her new interns, mostly women over 60. "They're not done," she said. "They're just finally being seen." Legacy isn't always built in what we do while we're here. Sometimes it's in what we inspire the others to begin. 6 months later, Hollow Ridge isn't empty anymore. It's not a busy place. It's not meant to be. But there's life. A steady rhythm of volunteers coming through. Lucas and Grace lead quiet training sessions, how to listen before you approach, how to speak softly to animals who've only ever known commands. George, for his part, teaches the early morning chores, watering, feeding, fixing broken fences. One boy, maybe 15, once asked why he kept coming. George just smiled and said, "Because kindness needs practice, same as anything else." One day, Lucas hung a new bell on the gatepost at the edge of the property. A simple brass one like the kind Grace had years ago. No sign beside it, no plaque. But if you need help, you ring it. And someone comes. It's not complicated. Just a promise. You are not alone out here. What Koda taught them wasn't about wilderness alone. It was about the wild inside us, the parts that fear, that run, that survive by staying hidden, but also the parts that remember, that return, that heal, love, loyalty, forgiveness. None of them tame us. But they do soften the places that have gone hard. They bring us back to ourselves. One evening, as winter deepened, George sat on the porch with Titan at his feet and Milo curled near the door. Lucas was inside writing. Grace was brewing tea. And as the first snow began to fall, George watched a young bobcat in the distance, not Milo. Another, cautious, curious, outlined in white. He didn't move, didn't call, just let it look. And then it was gone. But he smiled, because something about the way it stood, the way it held its ground, it felt familiar. If something in this story stirred something in you, a memory, a question, a small ache that asked for stillness, let it stay. Let it remind you that love, even when quiet, leaves a mark. That healing isn't about erasing scars. It's about having someone willing to walk with you through them. So if you've been holding on to something heavy, or waiting for a sign to reach out to come home to begin again, maybe this is it. If you found something meaningful in this story, I'd love to invite you to like and subscribe. It helps us continue sharing stories that matter, stories that connect us to nature, to each other, and to what we've almost forgotten. And if you'd like to go one step further, you can send a warm super thanks or donate to support the rescue and healing of wild animals like Koda. Every gift helps us give care, trust, and a second chance to those who can't ask for it themselves. Thank you for being here. And wherever you are tonight, I hope something wild and kind finds its way to your door.